Due diligence in private equity is obviously about assessing a potential investment, but it can also be about assessing a fund manager. Let's look at a specific case. A major developmental financial institution invests into emerging markets private equity fund managers, especially in the mid-cap area. This is consistent with the mandate of the DFI, which includes helping to develop the private sector without crowding out any private international investment, alleviating poverty and other developmental targets. The DFI has a group which assesses fund managers' proposals and decides whether to invest. Another group in charge of monitoring post-investment, another group in charge of valuing the portfolio, and an ad hoc advisory committee appointees who are not to be from the monitoring group. The DFI had investments in around 50 fund managers. Most fund managers provide quarterly and annual reports based upon IPEV or ILPA guidelines. The DFI also requires periodic ad hoc developmental impact reports. For each fund manager, every few years the DFI also commissions a report by a specialist external consultant to assess both a specific fund manager and the effectiveness of the DFI teams in analysing and monitoring the fund manager. A consultant was engaged to assess a South Asian mid-cap manager managing a $300 million fund. The investment thesis of the fund was to take large minority to majority stakes in industries facing the emerging middle-class consumer across several countries in its region. Value would be added by active management, which in the case of this fund manager meant sitting on boards and making sure they were functional, improving corporate governance in general, and helping with add-on acquisitions. This investment theme has been very common in emerging markets over the years. The fund had 12 investments in industries including personal care, chemicals, logistics, food, furniture production, financial services and others. 2 investments had been successfully exited and the manager was launching a second, bigger fund. The consultant found that the manager had adequately managed its portfolio with a couple of mistakes made. The overall conclusion was that the performance was a strong learning curve and many of the mistakes would be unlikely to be repeated in a second fund. On that basis, the consultant recommended the DFI invest in the second fund, even though the first was hardly exited. When assessing the DFI, the consultant found that there had been weak communication between the origination and monitoring team. The monitoring team had had a 1-year hiatus due to a personnel reshuffle. The monitoring team member was trying to second guess all the portfolio valuations of the fund manager by making his own models independently from the fund manager, with limited access to information. The valuation group relied on the above inputs and did not engage with the fund manager on the topic. The monitoring process was centered upon developmental outcomes and was missing fundamental items such as ownership of the GP and carried interest allocation among staff. The annual advisory board meetings that took place were carefully choreographed by the fund manager with lots of long, exhausting site visit trips and big meals, leaving limited opportunity for in-depth questions. The consultant recommended some measures to overhaul the DFI private equity organisation and procedures. What we can see from this case is that it is also quite common in the private equity world to perform a due diligence exercise on fund managers. Obviously, the things we look for are different, but it is an integral part of the industry practice.